is not getting into NATO unless there's a fundamental transformation in the relationship between Georgia and Russia in a positive direction, is because everybody in Brussels knows that 5 minutes after Georgia gets in, the Georgians are going to turn up at NATO headquarters and invoke Article 5 telling us the Russians have just done something. And the issue for NATO is not who wants to be in. We can't and we will not, as members of NATO, say to other countries, do not aspire to membership. We will not say that to the Georgians or the Ukrainians. But we, in the end, as member countries of NATO, have to ask a different question, which is, do we intend and can we deliver a defence of the members of NATO? And if we don't intend to go to war with Russia over Georgia, or intend to go to war with Russia over eastern Ukraine, and we don't intend to do either, let's be absolutely clear about that. That's a fundamental perception in most of the key capitals of Europe. Then enlargement will not be extended to those countries. And Rasmussen, who's an outgoing Secretary-General, can say what he likes. He doesn't, and this is one thing that people need to understand about NATO. The Secretary-General doesn't call the shots. He operates in a political environment in which the heads of state from the national capitals call the shots. And that's a fundamental point to keep in mind.
I'll come to you, Krishna, in a second. I'll just, Dmitry,
yes.
Is it a red herring? Is NATO's perceived threat a red herring, really?
Well, certainly it's not a red herring. And I appreciate what Ian Kearns has just said. I would like to believe it. I would like to believe that NATO Secretary General is not the same thing as Secretary General of the CPSU, you know, that his words are not going to have the same weight. But I'm very skeptical because we have seen how all 28 NATO member states aligned behind what Sani Handel described as Ukrainian people raising against the dictator. And basically, I think these words are, untrue, because Yanukovych, bad as he might be, was legally elected in 2010. That election was recognized by the West. So it was quite clear that the West was very partial in that confrontation, which was very bloody in Kiev. There were several dozen people killed. And it was very interesting that when there were rumors that Yanukovych might be using live bullets, the whole NATO said that he would be under sanctions, he would be arrested if he goes abroad. And now that the new Ukrainian regime is using aviation, tanks, artillery, whatever you want, in the east of Ukraine, there is not a single word of reproach. All 28
because they're trying to protect their own territory, that's why. I mean,
yes,
are you saying
I'm going to finish because I was not interrupting you. And when you said, for example, that no one has condemned the fact that Russia finances Assad, this is simply not true, because this was condemned at G8 summits.
So you agree that Russia? So you agree that Russia was financing Assad? You agree that, right?
No, I don't agree. But I think that Russia provided some moral support to Assad, and before the civil war in Syria, Russia helped Syria to build its army. I think if Assad had crumbled last year when the intervention by the Western powers was very near, IS, Islamic State, would be now in Baghdad, because Islamic State in Syria and Iraq is the strongest armed group in the area. It would have thrown out this useless coalition, so-called liberal coalition, in a second. It would have taken the chemical weapons and other weapons from the Syrian regime, and caliphate would
Islamic State wasn't even the caliphate wasn't even in existence a year ago. The caliphate was not even in existence a year ago.
Jabhat al-Nusra and other militant Sunni organizations were there, and they included the same people with the same ideology as the Islamic State. They were there from the very beginning of the Syrian revolution. Sorry, Sani Handel, but you are misbehaving. You have been telling lies here for 10 minutes and I didn't interrupt you, and now you don't let me say a word. What you said about Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a blatant lie, because I was there, I was reporting from there. The two English reporters who reported that the Russian column entered Ukraine, I worked with them in the Russia Profile magazine. They are pathological liars.
Okay, well, I don't have a problem.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're being carried away. Basically,
we're
discussing.
Just finish very quickly about what Sani Handel said, because it's important. There are 2,000, not 1,000 people killed in eastern Ukraine, and most of the 1 million refugees that Sani Handel talked about went to Russia, at least 700,000 of them. So it's a very strange situation when people go to the alleged aggressor instead of taking refuge inside their own country, which shows you the situation is a lot more complicated than Sani Handel wants us to believe.
I didn't say it
Dmitry, you hijacked my question. I was about to ask why the bulk of refugees went to Russia, but let's give a word to Chris Nineham, because he's been waiting for a long time to get in.
I admire his patience.
Just a couple of points, really. The first is that, I mean, I think you have to put yourself in the minds of people in Russia, and I must admit that Ian's kind of words of reassurance just seem to me to be completely unlikely to have any impact for a whole number of reasons. First, I mean, the West, including senior US officials, said back in the early 90s that the states previously in Soviet area of influence wouldn't be asked or wouldn't be allowed to join NATO. So these kind of assurances have no historical basis.
Again, that's not true.
And
That's not true.
it is true. But anyway.
You're rewriting history.
But what's happening? No, I'm not rewriting history. I'm talking about what's actually happened. But the reality on the ground is, since the 90s, a whole number of Eastern Europe countries have actually joined NATO. So it's not about rhetoric coming from NATO. It's about the physical reality. If you look at a map, what you have seen. Sorry.
So what?
Are you going to let me speak, Sonny, or not?
No, but let's have a discussion. This is a discussion, right? I mean, everyone can have a half an hour.
You're just interrupting me. Well, don't. I want to finish.
I thought we were having a discussion here. This is a discussion.
This is a serious situation. It's not this.
Sure. No one's denying that this is a serious situation, but we're having a discussion here.
Yeah, but it shouldn't be a shouting match, because otherwise our listeners would...
No, but you're interrupting me and you're not letting me speak.
When we're all talking all together.
I think we should all agree not to interrupt each other.
Exactly. So this isn't about rhetoric from NATO. This is about reality on the ground. And the reality on the ground is that Western power has been extended towards the borders of Russia systematically over the last 25 years. And anyone who thinks that that doesn't create a context which is going to threaten Russia is living in cloud cuckoo land, to be honest. And then, on top of that, you have to look at what's actually happened in the last months. And you have seen a government that was essentially a pro-Russian government that has been destabilised partly by protests internally, but has also been replaced by a government that was, as we know from leaked phone calls, was partly hand-picked by US diplomats whose discussions about who exactly should be in and out of the Ukrainian government were broadcast, so no one can deny that's a fact. On top of that, you have a massive increased amount of Western military presence in the region, including this summer scheduled war games being conducted by Britain, by US, by other NATO countries, actually in Ukraine. This was what was scheduled. So, I mean, the idea that that isn't going to create a crisis inside Russia, the idea that isn't going to create a situation of massive tension is just absurd, leaving aside the impact that it had on internal politics within Ukraine. That's point one. Point two, more briefly, is Sunny didn't mention the fact in his discussion about the causes of the current crisis in Iraq that since 2003 there was an invasion by NATO countries, by the leadership of NATO, which actually led to the death of, as we know, probably about 500,000 people, but more importantly, led to the destruction of civil society, the breakup of the infrastructure, led directly to, for the first time really in Iraqi history, massive tensions on the ground between Sunni and Shia, and a huge increase of sectarianism. Now, not to even mention that in your discussion of the situation now shows a complete lack of any serious analysis. I mean, whether or not you see it
as opposed to the Iran-Iraq war between two countries, which was all about sectarian violence.
We just agree not to interrupt each other?
I mean, come on, you're rewriting history and you expect no one to contradict you. That's ridiculous.
I expect no one to interrupt me, please.
Okay, you've had about half an hour to talk. Can someone else step in?
I'm going to finish my point.
If you could finish it briefly, because I'm
come on.
Okay, what I'm saying is that you can't discount the impact. I'm not saying it's the only factor. Clearly, that would be absurd. But the idea that we can discount the whole history of the recent occupation of Iraq by the Western powers in understanding how that country is fragmented and fallen apart is completely ridiculous. It has to be seen as a central element in any discussion, and therefore the idea of repeating the same, doing more of the same, bombing Iraq again, is an absurdity.
Let's just make it.
Come on, I've been patient for quite a while.
These are really brief points.
Sure, go on.
Just factually, let's get a few things straight. NATO didn't do anything in Iraq. Individual countries did. NATO did nothing. And this is a discussion about the NATO summit. And NATO is not doing anything now in relation to Iraq. The Americans are the only power carrying out airstrikes. There's no other NATO power that's yet taken that decision. There's no other NATO power that's taken that decision to do so. And there may be one or two out of the 28, but the rest will not. Secondly, it's just factually incorrect to say that the West promised that there'd be no NATO enlargement. That's just not true. What the Western powers promised would be that there'd be no permanent stationing of NATO forces in the eastern part of Europe, and that was a commitment made at the time. It's a commitment that will be has been honoured at least up to this point, but no promises were made about membership. Some difficult things happened in Kiev. I think there's some very important history to be written about what happened with the fall of the Yanukovych regime. I think we're all speculating about what really happened during that period. Yes, there were unfortunate statements made by American leaders that gave the impression that they were trying to engineer an outcome in Kiev, and maybe they were. But all of that said, I come back to the very first point I made. Other people have got responsibility here as well. And it may well be right that the American leadership were trying to engineer who would govern Ukraine. In Moscow, a decision was still taken to invade another territorially independent and sovereign state. Yes. And an invasion did take place in Crimea. And I'm sorry, Dima, your experience, I'm sure you report faithfully and sincerely. But I am telling you now, it is a factual truth. Russian military units and armoured columns are in eastern Ukraine. I've seen the proof myself. In Luhansk, in the last few days, there are Russian armoured columns there. And Russian military units are not just there handing over weapons to eastern rebels, they are fighting as integrated units. And that's precisely why the conditions on the battlefield have changed in recent days. And that's precisely why the peace deal that President Putin sketched out on a napkin on his way over to Mongolia the other day is being taken seriously by the leadership in Ukraine, which knows it's now fighting against the Russian army and not a bunch of ragtag rebels, and it knows it can't win and it's not going to get any support from the West.
Yeah, well, we may debate whether there are Russian troops or not.
It's my chance now.
Dmitry, first to Sunny, please.
Okay.
I heard you and I understand where you're coming from, but do you think there is a military solution to this at all?
I think yes. I mean, look, no, there is no military solution to this. I don't think that we should get into war. I think that Russia should pull back its troops, not just from eastern Ukraine, but also from Crimea. It is not a territory that it owns legally. And so Ian pointed out quite clearly, and I think it's astonishing that people who claim to be, stopping the war against war have completely, ignored the fact that Russia invaded another sovereign nation and have focused on Iraq and the bombardment of Iraq, which I opposed myself in 2003, but now have completely given a blank check to what, said nothing about what Russia did in eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. So now put that aside for a second. Let's talk about where we are. Everyone has their own views about what happened on the ground and who's responsible. And that can be debated endlessly. What NATO should have done ages ago, it should have stationed NATO troops in eastern Ukraine to guarantee Ukrainian sovereignty a while back. Then Russia would have had no excuse or would not have had a chance to invade and keep their troops on the ground. And that's what NATO is now going towards. And so we're basically now in a situation where they should have been months ago, so we could have avoided all this displacement. We could have avoided all the people who have died. We could have even avoided the disaster of the MH17 flight that went down because of weapons that reportedly came from Russia. So now all these people have died. And to what extent, so the point is NATO not only has to, for a start, NATO has to guarantee, and President Obama did do that. He said this week, last week he went there and he said NATO will guarantee the sovereignty of all its members, which was an important statement to make. And that means that NATO has to guarantee the sovereignty of the Baltic states.
Sunny, but Ukraine is not a NATO member.
I agree. Ukraine is not a NATO member, and I don't think that will change anytime soon. But I do think that NATO has to stand up for sovereignty. And I agree that there is a lot of sort of hypocrisy in the way that, for example, they invaded Iraq and they have now, said all this stuff to Russia for invading Ukraine. But that does not mean that other people are also allowed to be hypocritical. I mean, I remember just a few years ago when Prime Minister Vladimir Putin wrote about people invading other countries, wrote a piece in the New York Times, and now he's completely ignored that when he invaded Ukraine. So the situation of where we are is that NATO has to offer support to other countries in the Baltic regions and in countries like Poland, which are part of the coalition. And if Russia invades and keeps its troops and permanently destabilizes Ukraine, badly destabilizes Ukraine, then other states in those areas will get more worried that Russia is going to go after them next. And NATO has to guarantee their sovereignty. So it has to put troops there anyway,